scale, but I think we've been through things here a couple of times, and some of the information that we use at the farmer field scale will also apply to the homeowner gardener. So I guess with that, we'll probably jump into things.
Yeah. All right.
So I guess the title of what I'm going to talk about is more or less just soil health basics. I've already introduced myself, so we'll jump right into the next slide. So what is soil health? It's more or less the continued capacity of the soil to function as a vital living system that sustains plant, animal, and human health. So, there's, I don't know, I mean, that definition probably gets used in a lot of different capacities, but that's kind of the definition that we've used to explain things over the years. As far as defining soil health, there's 4 different principles that typically come into play. A lot of folks have integrated a 5th principle, but those 4 principles are keep the ground covered, minimize soil disturbance, increase crop diversity, and keep a living root in the soil. The 5th principle would be integrate livestock, and those things collectively are soil health. And a lot of folks will typically, like I'll have a farmer that'll come in that's been implementing cover crops on the field scale and might try to pat themselves on the back for saying that they're doing soil health. And I think it's a lot bigger picture than that. It's more of a systems type of approach. And that kind of goes into the next bullet, where soil health is a systems approach, or kind of a sum of the parts of those 5 principles. And ultimately a difference between the progressive adoption of each one of those practices, like cover crops to increase diversity or keep the soil covered or keep the root in the system, no-till to limit disturbance, keep the ground covered. So it's kind of a systems approach where, if we have a farmer that's doing a soil health system, it's typically a combination of cover crops, no-till, strip-till, nutrient pest management, those type of practices versus an individual practice like just a cover crop. But kind of ultimately, these soil health systems are supposed to mimic a natural way of, plant community working in harmony with the soil conditions, and also, a diverse plant community and the interactions where one thing's maybe blooming or, filling out its life cycle at different times throughout the year. So how do we measure soil health? There's a number of different ways. There's lab analysis, which Zach will maybe go into a little bit more detail later on here. With the lab analysis, the one thing that comes to mind with a lot of the folks I work with is this Heath soil test, and that's more or less a measure of biological activity at any given point in time. And with these lab analysis, more or less the what you get out of it is kind of more or less a function of what goes into it. So, if you're just going to take one probe, it's not really going to give you a good idea of what you got going on. I mean, as far as sampling, you need a number of different samples within your production unit. And then also you need to continually measure those things to be able to monitor progress, be able to establish a benchmark, that sort of thing. There's also field indicators of measuring soil health, and these are probably my go-to, especially with the physical properties. We also have chemical and biological assessments. With the physical properties, it's kind of, I guess, one of the adages that's out there is dig a little, learn a lot. You can learn a lot about what's going on with soil health just by taking a shovel out to the field. A good example, maybe you're in the field and you're trying to dig a hole and the ground's really hard, really compacted, and move over to the adjacent non-cropped area. Maybe it's woods or prairie or a fence row, and step on the shovel and it sinks right to the end. And you open the soil up and you're kind of looking at the picture there. The picture on the right is a real blocky, compacted soil structure versus the one on the left. You can see pore spaces, you can see roots pretty much throughout the entire profile. Maybe even find some earthworms, that sort of thing in there. So, those physical indicators are probably my favorite way of showing differences in soil health.
I was going to see if anybody, sorry, I was just going to check if anybody else is like You need to get it admitted. I don't know how this works, but oh, I guess it'll show up.
So moving on to chemical properties, electrical conductivity, pH, nitrate and phosphate levels, plant health, nutrient cycling, and identifying deficiencies. This is probably the least of those field indicators that I would use. You still need some specialized equipment to do this in the field. If this is something folks are interested in, I've got a lot of good fact sheets and a lot of good information on how you can incorporate this basically at your own field scale. But wanted to put that slide up there just to show that there are chemical properties that can be measured at the field level without having the need for a lab analysis. And then biological assessments, looking at soil food webs. You know, a lot can be shown just from getting down on your hands and knees and maybe moving some plant residues around and looking for the you know, the soil biology, more or less, the stuff that you can see, the shredders, the stuff that's taking a maybe a leaf and breaking it down into well, eventually into humus with the help of other soil microbes. But you know, the smell of the soil, does it have a real sweet earthy smell, or is it kind of just a stale blah smell? Temperature is also kind of something that's cool. You know, I put the chart up there that really shows you know, the relationship between soil biology, efficiency of that biology, and kind of life and death of that biology as soil temperature increases. You know, Zach and I were talking earlier here about you know, there's some kind of cultural barriers out there where a lot of folks think that your garden or your field needs to be completely black if it doesn't have a crop on it. You know, and soil temperature is going to have a direct relationship between you know, that black soil is going to be a conductor of heat, and it's going to warm up, you know, to more or less extreme temperatures that are actually going to be detrimental to your soil biology. So that chart is something interesting, kind of an eye opener for a lot of people. Another thing is rhizosheaths. I guess any sort of cool season cereal grain is going to you know, be a good indicator of that, where you pluck those roots out of the soil and you can actually see little bitty chunks of soil aggregates that are stuck to those roots, and more or less that's a function of a more or less a plant root biological exchange, where there's soil glues right at that root soil interface that are holding those little aggregates to the soil roots. So that's a good indicator of what's going on. Organic matter, I mean, just typical colors. You know, you might have hilltops where you know, the soil is all washed down the slope over the years versus a you know, a native system where we have good color to the soil, good, you know, good biological or organic component of it yet. And then a real simple one is earthworms. There again, dig a little, learn a lot. You know, you might actually see earthworms, or if it's real dry, you know, you might see the macropores that those earthworms create within a soil profile. This is a real interesting slide and something that kind of hits close to home for me. This is from a presentation that myself and Brandon Defoe had done a number of years ago. Brandon was the area resource soil scientist with the Northwest area of NRCS here a few years back, and he's since moved down to southern Minnesota. But these are all local soil samples that were taken. We have a rotational grazing system on the far left, continuously grazed system, or pretty much overgrazed system, second from the left. We've got no-till, second from the right, and then conventional tilled on the far right. And what we did with these is, this is the tabletop rainfall simulator, and we took and more or less put Tupperware on top that's got holes drilled in it, and simulated rainfall in each one of these sites. They all got the same amount of runoff over the same period of time. And you know, the Tupperware on the bottom is kind of a function of what, you know, what's infiltrating versus what's running off. And on the rotational grazing system, you know, you look in the container where it says healthy there, and there's really not much water that ran off. And that's a good indicator of soil health. I mean, with a functioning soil, you know, we're going to have those pore spaces. We're not going to have a lot of compaction, and the water is going to be able to infiltrate at a lot faster rate than something that's compacted or maybe overused. So, you know, this is a good indicator. And again, you might have to zoom in or take a screenshot and zoom in later, but you can see the beaker on the bottom of that rotational grazing system has got water that's infiltrated into it. It's relatively clear water. And then that soil has kind of acted as a sponge, and that water is stored for, you know, for production later on into the season. You get over into the continuously grazed system. we've got a lot of clean water that's run off. And we don't have very much water that infiltrated at all. The problem with that is most livestock producers I know are squealing about moisture concerns come July and August when Mother Nature decides to shut the drink off. So the ability to infiltrate is very important within that pastured land use. And again, that continuously overgrazed, probably a plant community that's not real diverse, probably some compaction issues with animals being out there for too long. Or too many animals over a short period of time, and we're just not infiltrating like we should be. And these are all fairly typical soils too. So I mean, we're not playing tricks and comparing sands and clays or that sort of thing. I mean, these are all Monoma County soils. Moving into the no-till, I wouldn't necessarily call this a soil health system, just for the fact that these folks have done, I believe, 15 years of either no-till or strip till. So there hasn't been any of the lift and inversion type of tillage where you're turning the soil over. The tillage that's done is more or less vertical tillage where it's basically just cutting. It's not doing any of the lifting or real severe disturbance. But and most of the tillage that they're doing is more or less just to size the residue. But you can see from that slide that we had a lot of infiltration. We've got a lot of residue on the soil surface. And being out on that site, you take a shovel full of that soil. There's great you observe great pores, both from earthworms and some soil aggregation that you can see. There again, there's really nothing that ran off that field. And then moving over into the conventional tilled system. So the guy that we got the conventional tilled soil from was in the crowd when we did this demonstration. And, he kind of prided himself on being a conservation farmer and doing some things outside the box. And I think he got real red in the face when he saw what the rainfall simulator actually showed of his soils versus this other guy that was doing a more conserving system than he was. But this is the issue that we run into with conventional systems, is that when we apply moisture, anytime that we get a rate of infiltration that's less than the rate of precipitation, we're going to have runoff. And you can see what that runoff looks like. There's a lot of suspended sediment within that runoff. There's a lot of nutrients that are bound to those soil particles within that runoff. And it's not good for the environment. It's not good for production. When we lose the soil, it's gone from the system. So this is just a real localized example of healthy systems versus not healthy systems. Soil testing, I guess not necessarily a measure of soil health, but something for the gardener, something to consider before you basically put seeds in the ground. I was telling Zach last week that I was on a farm visit here the other day, and the guy's got a high tunnel, and he brings me over to his high tunnel and asks me, what do you know about tomato production? The last couple of years my tomatoes have done worse and worse. They're really good when I'm raising them, and then as soon as I put them in the soil, they basically curl up and die on me. And I asked him if he'd soil tested, and he had said no. So ultimately I did get him a soil test kit in hand, but pretty much it's a means to identify what you can't see, and those variables that are causing issues within the soil can be more or less relayed to you back in the form of a soil test. That slide the picture on the left is more or less a something I got from, I think it was the University of Colorado. I'm sure I could have found a more localized example, but more or less they're saying a pound of, like 10-10-10 commercial fertilizer for 100 square foot a row or 100 foot a row would be what they would recommend in lieu of having a soil test. And then the picture on the right is more or less just kind of an example of what you would need to take a soil test, some sort of bucket, a shovel, or maybe a push-in soil probe. And then as far as, taking the test, there's a number of different folks that you could send it into. There's AgVise Laboratories, there's University of Minnesota. I like to use NDSU just for the fact that I've used them in the past, and it's real simple, but more or less, these are instructions right off NDSU's website as far as how to take the sample. More or less what they're saying is that if you've got a garden that's maybe, let's just say 20 by 50, taking one sample within that garden is probably not going to be a real representative of what you have going on there. So they're recommending taking a number of different samples mixing them together into your composite sample, and then filling up your soil sample bag with that composite sample to send in. Couple of different forms. This is basically there again on the left off of NDSU's website, on the right off of University of Minnesota's website. More or less asking you a few questions as far as, what you're looking for. That routine soil check is going to get you your macronutrients, your pH, your soluble salts, which I think is probably an issue with the guy that was having tomato production issues. There again, going back to that example, the first thing I noticed is that his soil surface kind of had a white tinge to it, and it looked like there was maybe some salts that were precipitating at the soil surface, and he didn't really even notice it until I pointed it out to him. But I hadn't seen his results yet, but I'm kind of thinking that he's probably got salt or pH issues that's causing production limitation. And then you can ask for micronutrients as well. That might be more important if you're trying to fine tune or maximize production, but otherwise that NP and K is probably going to be your best bet as far as what the limiting features are to production. So this is an example of a soil test that came back for a high tunnel. This is actually from a high tunnel that my dad has on his farm. And, the thing with a high tunnel is that more or less you're growing in the natural soil profile. Some folks are hauling in materials, but more or less this material is, native soil material that's underneath where you decide to put the high tunnel. He asked for the basic test, and basically the response from the test is that these nutrient levels are all sufficiently high, and NDSU didn't recommend any additional fertilizer in the spring. Now, the one thing, this test goes back to 2014, but the one thing that kind of caught my attention back then was, the lab went on to say that the soil appears to be very healthy. Well, without the lab knowing what the inputs were as far as how, maybe which of those soil health principles were being implemented here, I think that word healthy is maybe used out of context here, where, they should have said that the soil is very fertile or productive, and they're not going to have an issue with growing fruits and vegetables in there. But to call it healthy is maybe a reach at that point in time, and maybe with how things have progressed, they're maybe not using the same terminology. But I just wanted to point that out, that I didn't think that was really in context for the report that was provided. So that fifth soil health principle that we had talked about earlier, integrating livestock, a lot of folks might think, well, I don't have any livestock, I can't implement that within my operation. And I think it's maybe easier than a person thinks. The picture on the left is chicken manure, and the picture on the right is sheep manure. And it might be something just as simple as knowing a farmer within your community, getting to know that person, and simply asking them, hey, do you mind if I go out and harvest some manure from you? Bring your gloves, boots, and a bucket, and the next best thing to having livestock on your landscape. This is an example of a manure test that was sent in, and more or less just to try to put some perspective as far as how much manure do you apply in order to get the equivalent of that 1 pound of 10-10-10 per 100-foot a row. And I kind of did some math on this and determined with this sample, you basically need about 16 pounds of this chicken manure in order to get that equivalent of 1 pound of 10-10-10. Now, 16 pounds is a lot more than 1 pound, but what you get with this, you get a lot of micronutrients, and you get some instant biology with that as well. I mean, you add manure to the soil, and there's going to be biology within that manure that you otherwise wouldn't get with commercial fertilizer. So there's a lot of value in incorporating livestock in the form of either having the livestock on the land or having the manure on the landscape. This is just another example of sheep manure. There again, showing the NP and K equivalent of applying this at the field level. The sheep manure is not quite as hot as the chicken manure, but there again, if you get a test, or if maybe the farmer already has a test of what they have, and you can use that to kind of gauge how much you apply on your field or garden scale. So now I think we'll hand things over to Zach and let him talk about all things soil health.
Thanks, Dusty. Yeah, so I guess my part of the presentation, we'll be putting in, I'm just gonna see if anybody else is trying to join here. Let's see, looks like we're all good. So yeah, my piece is kind of applying them to that small scale. There's a lot of people joining today, and one of those questions is like, what if I'm just doing this on a garden scale, or how can I apply these soil health principles to the tools and resources that I have if I don't have, like a big farm operation? So we'll be showing some pictures of Minnesota farms and different ways you could apply the soil health principles. So indicators of soil health, a few of these slides are a recap, and then we'll get right into some pictures and applications. High microbial activity, like Dusty is saying, the smell test is good for that. An earthy smell, I suppose, or a good smell kind of shows that you've got a good amount of microbes. As simple as, just picking up the soil and giving it a sniff. Ability to infiltrate, as Dusty was saying, like the water not just leaching out those nutrients or losing actual soil is important. And ability to cycle nutrients, high in organic matter. So the humus or the pores. So you're creating these pores when you're adding organic matter, and that's really, really important. And we were chatting about it before, is like that's the home for the microbes. So it's giving it a space where they could actually create those aggregates and those glues that stick your soil together. And then the more of that, then the more infiltration you'll get. So the three components, another recap: biological, chemical, physical. I won't go too deep into it because Dusty just went over it. But just to show the biological, we're learning more and more that is one of the perhaps the most important of the three. And we're finding more and more about the microorganisms and the relationships that they have between the roots and nutrient passage, between the soil and the uptake of nutrients into roots, and how these microorganisms are actually the link between when you throw out your manures or your fertilizers, that it's not just that fertilizer going to the roots of your plants. You're also incorporating microorganisms. They have got a symbiotic relationship. So if you're creating an environment for your microbes, then you're doing a good job. And here again, 85 to 90% of soil function is mediated by soil microbial activity. And there's a lot of resources on this. If you want to kind of do a rabbit hole of looking into soil microbes, there's a lot of YouTubes and books about this topic. So this one test, Haney test, kind of goes into some of the, it's called a phospholipid fatty acid test. And the one on the right shows that anything over this 4,000 number is excellent. So this farmer here is a pretty good soil, and what it's doing basically is just testing the microbial activity, the micro community, and it's actually just weighing it out. So you could see how active those microbes are. That is the PLFA test. Now on the left, just a kind of broad analysis of going into some of these things, kind of get in the weeds, but there's a few things you could pay attention to, like soil health, soil pH, and then total nitrogen, organic nitrogen, and that test microbial active carbon, that one right there under calculations, that is fairly low on this particular test, and that's in direct relationship to the total nitrogen and the total organic carbon. So a lot of the results kind of show this relationship. If you're low in one area, you're going to be low in another area, and you kind of have an idea of whether your soil's generally healthy. But like Dusty is saying, it's not just one test you could tell. It's like if you're practicing these principles and you're doing this in a more kind of holistic view, not one test is going to give you the idea of your soil is healthy or not. So, and just one more slide, keep the living roots hydrated. This is a picture of microbial fungi that are beneficial to your plant roots. So feeding the microbes and minimizing soil disturbance, physical, biological, and chemical. Physical, you're like over tilling, you're compacting. You don't want to step in your beds too much. Most of us kind of know this, but yeah, if you've got too many animals, just running over your tilled soil, that's going to create some compaction, not giving enough pore space for those microbes to live. And then chemical misuse of fertilizer, pesticides, maybe you're adding too much manure or too much fertilizer. So you just want to kind of put out the level that's recommended or that you've done before, years before knowing your soil. And these are those 5 principles again: keep the soil covered, minimize disturbance, increase crop diversity. The diversity above the grounds kind of reflects the diversity beneath the ground. So in Mexico, what they call is a milpa system, or like a 3 sisters garden here in White Earth. You're diversifying your crops above the ground. So it's going to have diversified microbes beneath the ground. And as we know, ecological systems like thrive in diversity and don't do quite as well with like a monocrop situation. So keep a living root in the soil. That kind of goes into cover crops, and we'll discuss that next week as well. But if you can keep your ground covered, like Dusty is saying, like the bare black ground gets up to 95, 100 degrees, you're pulverizing the soil. Soil is has living organisms in it, and you don't want to just have like 120 degree soil. And keeping living roots in the soil helps cool it down. And then integrated livestock. So these are some Minnesota farms. We'll get to, I think, a few in a row, and then we'll get to see how they do applications of these 5 principles on a smaller scale and a fruit and veggie scale as well. So this is Solar Fresh Produce. They're vegetable CSA near the cities. We've got East Henderson Farm. This is Josh Henderson. And they're family farms, they're holistic farms. They're looking to create an environment of health and community health. They're selling to their community. These are all part of their mission. This is my farm, North Circle Seeds. Yeah, we grow garlic and organic seeds. And okay, we're getting right to it. Cover cropping. This was one method from the Solar Fresh, Sarah Lindblom. She broadcasted oats, winter rye, and wheat. You can see that coming up on the left. And then she's just mowing it with a scythe. She's going back to, I guess, the 1800s here and using a scythe to mow it down. I found the scythe pretty useful when cutting some of my small corn crops. So some of these older, smaller tools are useful. And then if you need to till, it's more about minimizing tillage. So you could till this in as a green manure, or mow it down. So you could do it whatever works for your operation. And this is what Sarah did at her operation. And then some cover crops maybe are food for humans as well. Purslane and lamb's quarter. People eat that in Europe. That's considered a food source. Wild spinach, and you can see on the right is some purslane spiking up, and it's kind of got like a lemony flavor. And on the left there, lamb's quarter, it's got a lot of nutrients in it. So if you like the flavor, it's a little bit different, but it's good for you, and you could eat it. And maybe talk about how you could eat some of your weeds and put it in your CSB box if you're gonna may be a little bit risky. People won't know what you're doing, but maybe spark a good conversation. Here's a hairy vetch next to the Josh's dog there, grew maybe, looks like maybe over 2 feet tall. And after he disked it in, he had the best winter squash crop ever. So timing, I suppose, is another thing to consider with cover crops. You could throw it in the spring or the fall before the winter and have it overwinter, or disc it in and get a fall crop or squash crop. And then on the right, you can see he's cover cropping in between his rows there. And then I think mowing. So keeping that living root in the soil. That's the principle here with cover cropping. Mulching, covering the ground. So that's that principle. This was Josh's farm, East Henderson. They're just using their hay from their barn because they had it and it's free. And they were, I don't remember what they're growing in there, maybe potatoes or something, but it's one way to do a no-till system, is to just mulch and drown out the weeds with shade, basically. If you've got enough mulch, I've seen the system work. There are a few tweaks that you might have to do, and there are maybe a few concerns with disease, but if you get the right kind of grass and the right amount of mulch and maybe move it around a little bit, I've seen it work. At Prairie Road Organic Farm, they have a whole acre garden that's all mulched and they don't till ever. So they've got really, really rich soil with earthworms. Here's a Redford garden, Kathy Connell's farm. She's mulching here with some straw. So she's not tilling either. She had really, really sandy, low quality soil when she first moved there. And over time, she's built her soil up to really high organic matter just through using those soil health principles. This was my farm a few years back, and we did mulching with potatoes. You can see it got a little out of hand. The rows are a little small, but what you don't see is a lot of weeds, and you see a lot of potato plants. So we got a pretty good crop of potatoes with after lightly tilling and using straw mulch. So tarping is another thing, kills weeds. You could lay a huge tarp. This is Lida Farm, Pelican Rapids, and kind of gets your soil ready after lifting that tarp up. You can see on the right there, pretty much ready to go. Maybe a light till, or yeah, it's killing the weeds. So you just want to be sure you're paying attention to anaerobic bacteria levels, and if you're creating any mold out there, so maybe check on it periodically. But it's a way where you pull it up, it's almost useful for planting right away almost. Three Sisters traditional mound systems. There's a lot of good info in Buffalo Bird Woman's Garden book. She goes through a few designs. You can see one of those designs in the middle, where the C is corn and B is beans and S is squash. We have corn mounds, bean mounds, and squash kind of surrounding it. The corn uses the beans as a nitrogen fixer, and they kind of got a symbiotic relationship there, where the beans could climb up the corn if they're pole beans and the corn's strong enough to take it. And the squash can protect the system in theory from from deer, but also it's just three really hardy crops that have been grown traditionally for thousands, couple thousand years. So this was at Land Recovery. I helped do this mound system, one of the mound systems, corn, bean, squash. Just built all these mounds, and then we dug in fish guts under the mounds. So the corn really takes up the fish guts pretty quickly and efficiently. Becomes like a pretty dark green. But yeah, it's doable. It takes a lot of shovel work rather than tiller work. So maybe good for a community to do, community gardens, a bunch of people doing it together. And we've done it at the Monoman spot before too. Use what you have. These are just old garden seeds on the left that didn't Sarah didn't know if they're going to germinate or not, so she just threw it out into the field as a cover crop. Kind of a nice diverse amount of things growing as a cover crop. There's beans and looks like mustard seed and marigold seed in there. So again, I guess diversity. And then kind of you get creative where you're intercropping. Again, this is kind of keeping that plant diversity. So she had radishes around her, it looks like cucumbers. So the radishes would go before the cucumbers are ready. So and kind of utilizing most of your soil or more of your soil, and then also diversity of crops. Interplanting, same concept. This looks a little close, but if you could get lettuce and use different levels of the soil. So something like a lettuce isn't going super deep, and then something like a corn is going using more of like a taproot or a big taproot. So you could use different levels of the soil as well and plant in different levels. Another example, it's kind of like the two sisters, corn and beans. This can be done on a bigger scale, farm scale, where maybe you're planting your corn first around now, like May 20th, when there's no more frost, and then maybe wait a week or two, and so you can plant your beans. And if you've got a good beans to corn varieties where the beans will grow up the corn and not take it down, that'd be a good system, polyculture. And not all of your weeds are bad because they're keeping that living root in the soil, less soil erosion. I mean, if you're just tilling your whole garden spot all the time, even in between the rows, there's going to be some of that erosion. So, I mean, this kind of looks messy in a way on the left, but it's keeping the grass. The grass is the living root. So generally, if you can manage it this way, it's a good thing. Overwintering cover crops, we kind of got to that. This is the typical rye and vetch seed in August, and then it'll come up and you can mow it in as green manure. Permaculture, or just, well, this is utilizing chickens, kind of getting creative, utilizing livestock. This was at my place, a chicken tractor. Like Dusty is saying, like rotational grazing, moving every day is a good technique, because then these chickens are kind of, and other livestock kind of tend to mob graze. They just like stick their heads down and just get right to business, and they eat, maybe they eat a little bit more, or they concentrate and eat maybe some weeds or other grasses that they wouldn't normally eat if they were just thrown out into an open field. And then if you're moving them every day, then you could see the result of the green, lush grass and manure that they leave behind. So you're creating a better pasture and better soil health on your pasture. If the more you're grazing in it, where the animals are tighter and they're moved more often, rather than just like letting them out on the open field, because then they could, then they're just eating like the McDonald's. They're just eating their best grass that they love, and they're leaving everything else too. So they're not actually cultivating a good diversity too for your soil. Some small equipment. There's a thing called slow tools out there. You could find small equipment like this to help with no-till or on garden scale. So that's a good thing. It always helps to have the right kind of equipment. It just makes life easier. You don't want to always just use the scythe and the shovel. So here's I don't know if everybody can see this, but that's no-till vegetable transplanter.
It looks expensive.
Yeah. everything looks good in a 5-minute video, but and they're probably just not just throwing into like completely untilled. They probably work that up and have a mulch, or hopefully they're not just planting in the grass.
I think what that is it's probably rye that was crimped earlier in the video. They showed that stamping machine. And if you crimp rye when it's flowering, it'll actually break the stalk and kill the plant. And there's some pretty big timing issues with that, where if the last thing you want to do is plant a cover crop and then not know how you're going to terminate it, because it can become a weed and compete with your cash crop. But in this case, they've terminated the rye, look like through crimping, and now they're basically no-tilling into that rye mulch. And the weed suppression benefits, the moisture conservation, the nutrient cycling. There was a living root in that soil that's now providing basically habitat for soil biology. You get all those benefits through cover cropping, and start applying those principles, stacking them on top of each other to maximize your benefits.
Yeah, I didn't even notice that. So that's why there's 2 of us. Yeah, just getting back to the basics. Manure, it's as simple as that. For your additives, like you could get it looking at your soil test results and NPK, and that's really good to see where you're at. But at the end of the day, for my farm and a lot of people, just using compost and manure is the 2 go-to. Sometimes fish emulsion has a good strategy. If you're doing drip irrigation, you could add that into your drip. There's a few good sources, like Cowsmo I found is a good compost, and composted chicken, poultry manure. Ag Resource in Detroit Lakes right here sells that. So you don't want to add too much. You certainly could, because it is pretty hot with the poultry manure. So some ideas of non-manure fertility with the fish fertilizer. A lot of it comes into like a concentrate. So if you just want to read your label and make sure that you're adding not too much. If it's really concentrated, yeah, you're just adding like a 1:40 ratio. They're making them a little bit less concentrated recently, I've seen though, so maybe a little bit more than that. But yeah, just read the label of what you get. And topsoil composts, yeah, these aren't you don't have to be quite as specific. The compost isn't gonna burn your crops or anything like that if it's good compost. So Kathy Connell uses ground soybean meal, so that's another thing you could try. Wood ash, you just want to be careful not to add too much of that either, but could add some of that soil organic matter. And if you want to get really complex, you've got this compost tea, and there's strategies online how to aerate and do that correctly without creating anaerobic bacteria. Increasing soil health could potentially decrease your input over time. Basically, if you're just creating more of a home for those microbes, and you're eventually gonna have you could save money on fertility if your soil is holding more moisture, and creating the opportunity for nutrients to get to your plants. Increase water retention. We've seen like these strategies with SFA at the conference. Someone was saying how they're doing the rotational grazing with the chicken tractor, and then across the field, across the street, somebody else like not doing that. And like when it rained, just seeing like the flow of water on this field of this person not using that technique, and then the lush green, dark green grass on the person doing the rotational grazing. So the best observation is just using your observation skills. Be creative, use what's around you. Like a lot of these small farmers just using tools and like the hay in the barn. And the big thing is those 5 soil health principles. They're principles. They're not techniques amongst themselves. So they're just guiding principles, and you can be creative to utilize them for what works best in your operation. So soil health is also kind of relates to our own human health. On a grander picture, we're losing about, I think it's something like a 16th or an 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch a year of soil in like Iowa and these places that are these belts that we have the best soil, some of the best soils in the world. And if we keep going the way we're going with erosion, we're not going to have agriculture as we know it in 100 years. So we've got to start taking this soil health stuff seriously and figure out some new ways to advance. So,
and I guess just some of the conclusions from what I was talking about earlier. If you're wanting to apply some of these soil health and gardening techniques, you're going to have to change the mindset or that culture of everything needs to be black within the rows. You got to keep your rows tilled to keep them clean. Start substituting mulch in place of tilling the rows, and maybe even start at a smaller scale within an already small scale. So maybe start it on, just a few rows or quarter or half of the garden or something like that. Again, dig a little, learn a lot. Next time you're out and about, take that shovel and dig it in an area that's had a history of tillage, and then go somewhere that hasn't. Notice that good soil structure in the area that hasn't had tillage, and notice how blocky and heavy that soil is where there has been tillage. Make it a fun learning experience. Get kids involved if you have it. I mean, they're going to be the means to changing the culture that we have now. Get the youth involved, get them to think outside the box, and I guess maybe bring hope to to what Zach was talking about. Some of the methods that are out there today on the larger scale aren't necessarily sustainable. The soil health means of agriculture is something that will be and is sustainable in the long run. And kind of lastly, don't give up. I mean, if you try something and it doesn't work, don't chalk it up as a failure right away. It does take time to start to see changes in the soil. Your soil's not going to change overnight. I think a lot of us are impatient. I mean, it's in my nature anyway. And if I don't see results right away, I'm looking at trying something different, and giving up. But a lot of the folks that have made struggles and paved the way for this soil health movement have shown us a lot of examples of what they've done. And you don't have to reinvent the wheel. I mean, do a web search, figure out what's out there for information. I mean, Zach or myself are available to provide some technical assistance too, but take baby steps and don't give up. So that's my contact info. I guess if anybody has any questions, I mean, we're located, or my office is located right next to the White Earth Natural Resources office, right on Highway 59 in Mahnomen. My number and email are up there. Otherwise, I'm sure Zach is, he's on the SFA website and whatnot, as well as White Earth. So both of us are available if anybody's got any questions.
So this was a partly SFA presentation. That's why that logo is kind of there. Kind of borrowed it because I actually helped make this presentation a few years back. So that's kind of why that's all over the place. But yeah, through Lake Agassiz SFA, or of course, White Earth Food Sovereignty right here in Mahnomen. That's my email there. I'll go back to Dusty's. It's got some more stuff there too. But yeah, if anybody has any questions we ended a little bit on the early side. So if anybody has any questions on soil health, what they're up to this year, it's kind of like the time to maybe it's too late at this point because it's, you almost wanted to have your plan in place by now, but there's still some things you could do for the fall cover crops and kind of on that planning side of things. So yeah, anybody have any questions on soil health or applications or what they're up to?
Well, for us, bonjour, hi Dusty, hi Zach. This is Lisa Berner at the White Earth Tribal and Community College Extension Service Department, and we started doing the cover cropping because we had put in a acre garden last summer, and with Bob, he noticed that we used sorghum Sudan as a cover crop because it was old industrial agricultural land, and it was really full of that clary grass or whatever they call that, and it was really hard to break up and get rid of. And so he found that the sorghum Sudan was the better cover crop to go for, to kind of help break up that soil and that grass. So what he noticed this year with well tilling was that there was it retained more moisture, and so the soil, of course, improved soil health. So I really appreciate the webinar and sharing your knowledge with it and how we can continue to grow and build our soil health. And I like the message of your fields don't need to be all black and black in between. And we also had the privilege to go and visit the food farm down by Duluth there, and all of theirs is cover cropping, and they do the rotations of their planting, and that the cover crops actually help reduce a lot of the weeds and stuff with their plants. So it just takes time, and like you said, just keep figuring it out and don't give up, and good things can happen. So miigwech.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, and when you're saying a weed, Dustin and I were saying this last week, like a weed is what, it's just a plant at a place. So some people, and then like the purslane and the lamb's quarter, it's like some people farm that stuff.
Oh, it's good. It's in my garden. I appreciate it and I eat it. And
Yeah.
but I think too that I think that just goes with the need for education and understanding what is actually in your gardens, and it is helpful and good. You don't have to be pulling and whatnot unless it's choking out your plants.
Yeah.
But that would be about it. And the same with dandelions. Big Egg, created it as a weed, and it's not. It's a superfood, and it's good for your soil. They're showing up because it's trying to amend your soil, and you can eat every part of it, the root, and you can make medicines from it, and which I do. So I'm happy to see all of the yards with it. And it made me sad to see an old lady out in her yard the other day with a can of spray of Roundup, spraying them and trying to kill them. And of course, not understanding that circle of life and the importance of having pollinators like that, because they're the first food for bees, which we desperately need. So, yeah.
Yeah, wild food education. Maybe we should do another one, and not with me talking, but that'd be great to do. Maybe a follow-up at some point with wild foods or foods that you could just see around us to use and utilize. Then probably see things a little bit differently that way too. Like, yeah, not just tilling over everything. Maybe like, oh, there's a lamb's quarter and there's a dandelion, and I could use this for that. So you're kind of using different eyes to see things too.
Yeah. Yep, they're all helpers. So
yeah, I can see that the dandelion's kind of almost like a taproot, and then people have made like coffee out of, or it almost has that like coffee flavor when it's roasted and ground up.
It does.
Dandelion tea.
Yep. I make dandelion salve.
And I remember I forget her name right now. It was Tanya, or not Tanya. I'll remember in a minute, but she had as part of the Indigenous Farming Conference, her mom was taking dandelion for diabetes, and they were noticing that it was helping with that a little bit too, just regulating. So maybe a medicinal as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. The leaves, the entire plant is edible. Yeah, so it's good for you. Yeah.
Yeah. Any other questions on soil health or applications, or you're starting your garden and kind of question like, how could I use any of those 5 principles, or general questions? Well, I suppose with that, we recorded it, so I'll make a YouTube link out of this. There was a person that asked if they could get access to it after, so that was the reason. And I'll put it up on YouTube, and then I think we could get it on our website. So if you want to leave your contact info, I think I have everybody's here, I suppose. I didn't have Michael's, but thanks everybody.
Yep. Miigwech, thank you.
Thanks.